All right. Well, I think we'll go ahead and get started, and then others will likely join us as time goes on, but we will have a recording available to you all afterward. Hi, everybody. I'm Jill Morris. I'm the Executive Director of PALCI. Welcome to our last in our series of panel presentations for our member meeting summer event series. We're really glad to bring this wonderful group of presenters to you today, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves in just a few moments. Before we get started, I did just want to say thank you again to our sponsors for this event series. EBSCO and ProQuest both sponsor PALCI's member meeting, and they have for the last 4 years now. So we want to be sure to say thank you to them if you see your rep. They did also provide us with some vendor-sponsored sessions, which let you know sort of a little bit about what they're up to and what kinds of new things they're working on. So I'd encourage you to check those out. They're available in our Skype calendar. I also want to let you know that we do have a PALCI Code of Conduct, which was approved by our board in May of 2020. I would encourage every PALCI member to read it. It is available on the PALCI website at palci.org/conduct, and you'll find more information about that. And we expect to follow it for all of our events, whether they're in person or virtual, as they all are these days. So please take a look at that when you get a moment, and know that this is the expectation for behavior within our consortium of all members. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our wonderful panelists who we have today speaking about the topic of job searches and hiring and professional development in the time of COVID-19, which has obviously upended many of our processes. So today, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator for today's session, Tim Schlak, past president of the PALCI board and dean of libraries. And actually, you have a new title now at Robert Morris University. So I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself, Tim.
Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to be hearing from a distinguished group of panelists from a variety of PALCI member libraries. And we're going to be talking from the perspective of both those looking to secure a job and those looking to fill a position. Before we get too far along, we'd like to run a brief poll to understand more about your primary interest in attending today, whether you're here for job searching or job filling. Jill is going to share on the screen the poll, and please take a moment to respond. And results are anonymous and only intended to guide our responses today. So you should see that on the screen now. Okay, as we wrap that up, we'll move along here. I'm going to be posing 5 or 6 questions to our panel, and we'll leave approximately 10 to 15 minutes at the very end for questions. Feel free to post any questions throughout the session to the chat box, and I'll do my best to work them in either into a question I pose to the panelists at the end or at the end when we get to the Q&A. Our panelists today come from Carnegie Mellon, Dickinson, and Lycoming College, and I myself come from Robert Morris. I'd like to ask our panelists to take a moment to introduce themselves, and then we'll get started with our first question. We'll kick things off. So why don't we turn to Joelle? She's first in the queue there. You could give us a brief introduction. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. My name is Joelle Pitts. I'm the Associate Dean for Administration, Planning, and Assessment at Carnegie Mellon here in Pittsburgh. I began in this role in February, so I can to some extent speak from personal experience about what the onboarding process looks like during a pandemic, but my portfolio here at CMU also covers HR for my library, so we've interviewed and brought in several positions over the summer during this pandemic, and I can discuss some of the details there as well. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Paige, let's turn to you.
My name is Paige Flanagan. I am the, can you hear me? Mm-hmm. I'm the library director at Lycoming College. This is my second year at Lycoming. Prior to this, I was the academic technology librarian at Hampden-Sydney College in Virginia. And prior to that, I was at the University of Florida Law School down in Gainesville. In my role here, I've had to run a search completely online and onboard someone. So it can be very tricky, and we're glad you're here, and we hope we can help you.
I guess I'm next. I'm Maureen O'Brien Dermott. I'm at Dickinson College, and I'm the Associate Director for Access and Building Services. I recently completed 3 hires for paraprofessional positions. So we are now in the onboarding process and orientation process.
Thanks so much. Thanks to our panelists today. Why don't we go ahead and get started. Before we do that, I would just share the results of the poll. Oh, they were there, now they're gone. So it looks like we are evenly split between hiring and filling and the other category, 2 other categories that have equal representation of job seeking. So a quarter of us are looking at job seeking, and then a quarter of us are wondering about other kinds of concerns. So I'd love to hear more about that, whether that's hiring, job seeking, or especially other, through the chat function. And I would love to incorporate those questions in as we go. But for now, let's get started with our first question to the panel. Hiring new faculty and staff is often an exciting and predictable process. While exciting, predictability went out the window with COVID-19, and in its place, we have volatility and uncertainty. What are your thoughts for those seeking a job and those seeking to fill a position at a time like this, where working conditions no longer resemble their stable incarnation in years past, and uncertainty about the coming months and years pervade? Would anyone like to lead us off here?
I'll be happy to jump in. One of my initial thoughts was about for the job seekers that sometimes you're seeking employment not because you have to, but because you're seeking other challenges, or you want to move to some geographic location or some other reason. And at this time, I would say if you don't have to move, I suggest you wait. Some places right now have a last in, first out policy, which means you could be putting yourself in jeopardy from a stable position into something where you could be hired and then let go after a short amount of time. The volatility of this market is amazing. So, but if you do have to go, then make sure you dot all your I's and cross all your T's, because the market is very full right now. We had a huge number of applicants for our position as an instruction librarian. So make sure you are fully prepared and everything is in order, because it's a buyer's market right now.
I would agree with Paige. If you don't have to search for something new right now, it might be a good time to work on professional development at your current institutions in preparation for a move in the future. But if you do have to go out and seek something new, I would really stress patience and flexibility. Parts of the hiring process that before the pandemic took weeks or longer might take months or longer now. The timeframes can be significantly delayed and expanded. And I would also expect most, if not all, of the interview process to occur virtually, with a few exceptions. But those virtual interviews can be, to some degree, fairly awkward on both parts. Employers and search committees are doing the best that we can to present our organizations in the best light, answer the questions we have with the information that's current at the moment. But that information is constantly changing, sometimes by the hour, and we often have to alter our arrangements on the fly. So it's something to just be aware of as you're progressing through the interview process. But I would also offer maybe some cautious optimism. I think that the pandemic is changing the way that we work and the work that we do. And those who are really ready to jump into a new and changing landscape with a really flexible attitude are going to be the sought after candidates in any search.
Yeah, and I just want to echo what Joelle's saying. Flexibility and adaptability in this market has to be the priority. for the job seeker and the employer. You know, we also have to take into consideration, you know, demonstrated motivation in the job seeker, you know, because we may not be working with these people. You know, there's a lot right now. We are still in a semi-lockdown situation. So you want to be able to hire good people with good time management skills.
Great. Thanks so much. I'd like to pose a follow-up question to something Paige had mentioned. She was saying that it's a good time to work on professional development. So what are your thoughts about the positions that would ordinarily have been hired? There's all this volatility, and there's also hiring freezes at so many institutions. When those hiring freezes are lifted, perhaps 2021 sometime, do you think there will be a glut of positions that hit the job market? Certainly the job market is slowed. If you look at the ALA job list, it has maybe a quarter of the positions it used to have, or even fewer. So what are your thoughts about that? And perhaps what skills do you think we could be working on, even especially during professional development right now, that would pay dividends once the positions perhaps do open up?
I think any type of engagement with instructional technology, online learning platforms, streaming video, all of those types of things that support our online learning efforts right now, I think are not going to go away once we return to our campuses full time. I think this pandemic is going to fundamentally alter some of the ways that we teach in higher ed, at least in this country. And so I would say continue to focus on building skills in the areas that are currently in high demand because they're not going to go away anytime soon.
And I tend to be an optimist, but I'm a little bit pessimistic in terms of a potential job glut in 2021. My concern is that administrations will begin to see certain amount of savings, cost savings, and if they don't get the number of students back, if they lose a lot of students and the student body drops overall, there may not be a big glut of jobs. So I wouldn't count on that.
And I would just add that I think that the skills are always important, but when you're interviewing, the skills are important, but your ability to talk about those skills is as important in the interview setting too. So there's lots of techniques for these kinds of, to build these kinds of techniques or skills. One of those would be the STAR technique of just telling a situation, a task, an action, and a result in a compressed format. And so those are things we can work on right now. And to be a candidate who stands out after all of this, after working from home for 6 or 12 months, I think that somebody who can really tell a story, and maybe even tell a good story about lockdown and how they were flexible, is going to be your above average kind of candidate. So I'll just wrap up with that. Let's move on to the next question. This one has to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. When it comes to hiring, the experts in diversity, equity, and inclusion point out that looking for the perfect fit in a candidate may introduce hidden biases. That is, pursuing fit may mean that your next hire will sound, look, or think a lot like your last hire, and before you know it, you're sorely lacking in diversity. And yet experts on the job process will coach you to be someone who can answer the interviewer's question with a story to personalize yourself, but also to make yourself look and sound like the kind of person they'd want to have a beer with afterwards. So what's your advice to employers and potential employees in navigating this kind of paradox, especially during the virtual times we find ourselves in?
Well, I'll start. From an employer's perspective, I think one of the things that we have to always remember is to be vigilant. You know, keep our assumptions in mind when we're starting the interview process. You know, our candidates may not have the best Wi-Fi and the best situation. They may be caring for children and not have a quiet place to work. So, you know, just be aware of your biases. Go into the interview process with knowing who you are and your assumptions and keeping them to a minimum.
I think just to tack on to what Maureen said too, I think during the interviews, we should consider reframing our questions to highlight the kinds of behaviors we want to see in the virtual environment. So going back to the flexibility and adaptability, the storytelling that Tim mentioned, reframing your questions in a way that brings some of that out, I think can help us get to the more important elements that we want to look for in any search.
And to those who are seeking positions, I highly recommend that you take the be yourself approach. If they interview you and they hire you, great. If they don't because of who you are or what you look like, great. You probably don't want to work there in the first place. So it becomes a win-win situation. And I lived that when I was hired here at Lyco. I determined that I was going to come in and be myself and see what happened. And they have accepted me and I have loved working here. The environment is exactly what I saw on my interview. To employers, I recommend don't fear diversity. Ibram Kendi, the author, talks about how it's not enough to not be racist. You have to be anti-racist. And the difference is being very purposeful and active in what you're doing. And so I would recommend to employers that you predetermine what you're seeking in terms of the job, not the person.
So we've touched on this a little bit. I wonder if I can ask a follow-up question. There are various types of interviewing techniques, and we've touched on one of them, I think, which is behavioral interviewing. So tell me about a time. I wonder if we could kind of jog people's memories over the past 6 months about what would be an example, for instance, of a time where you encountered something a situation where you had to tell me about a time where you did this, where you achieved this thing, or the circumstances were difficult and you did this. I think we're suggesting that that's going to be a popular kind of question. So to help our members anticipate, I wondered if we could sort of talk for a minute about what that looks like from the from the employer perspective. Why would we want to know those things? So thinking about like March and April, what sorts of things were happening then in your libraries? And how has that shifted your thinking about the kinds of skills you would be looking for? We've talked about adaptability and flexibility, but I wonder if we could get a little more specific there and think about maybe the things you saw amongst your staff and your personnel that going forward you're going to be using as perhaps a model or an example of this is the sort of thing we need in the future. This is the sort of skill set we need.
I would be looking for someone who can sort of enumerate and delineate steps to anything that they're talking about. That became critical for us here at Lycoming, where as we began our planning, we had to go through a number of steps to get where we wanted to be. It was a massive lift to do so. And then we had to do it again in order to reopen for this fall. So I would really be listening for someone not only to tell a story, but to tell me the fact that they were going through a process of thinking and then they laid out various steps and then came upon a success.
For me, I kind of see this in two ways. One is I ask behavioral questions to see if the candidates can highlight the impact that their behavior had on the organization, on the project that they were working on. I'm kind of constantly trying to root that out when I interview candidates. The second piece, I think, would be trying to determine from the candidates' stories and from their accounts of experience if they're exhibiting something like organizational citizenship. So are they not only doing the task that's required or that's asked of them, but are they doing it, you know, in a way that helps some of their other colleagues complete their tasks? Are they helping the organization move forward in a positive way? Those are the types of things that I look for in behavioral questions and answers.
Yeah, I'm pretty much in the same line with Joelle. You know, we rely so much on teamwork here. We cross-train heavily, so we share tasks and access services, so we don't have any downfall, or we don't have somebody not doing what needs to get out the door. So, you know, really focusing on team awareness and teamwork is really important questions that we try to get to the heart of, how people interact with the team.
Okay, great, fantastic. Let's move on to our next question. Job searches that are being conducted now are being compressed and compacted down from 2, perhaps 3 days, down to a day or a day and a half, and they're often occurring in entirely virtual environments. What recommendations would you make to a library looking to conduct such a search in order to reduce tensions and ensure things run smoothly?
I can kick this one off. We aren't holding any in-person interviews right now and likely won't for the foreseeable future. So I'll offer just a few things to think about within kind of the virtual interview space and hope that some of my fellow panelists might be able to comment on the in-person tips. But the first that I would offer is ensure that each candidate has or is at least offered a trial run with the technology that you're going to be using for the interview. Believe it or not, not everyone has attended a Zoom meeting before. I had encountered one the other day, which was amazing, but they're out there. So at least offer them a trial run with the technology you'll be using. I'd say also create very clear and concise instructions and agendas for each segment of the interview, especially if it's going to happen over multiple days. Include a written list of the attendees and their titles in each session. It's hard for, I think, in-person interviews to keep track of everybody who sits in on your sessions. And I think it's even harder in a virtual environment because you're often looking at a table with people sitting around it and you can't see facial expressions very well and kind of match names with faces. So include those attendees in each session. And then finally, build in breaks for the candidates as you would for an in-person interview, and don't schedule virtual sessions back to back without at least 15 minutes in between, because that will avoid the kind of awkward early entry of the next round of interviewers and will allow you to use the same link for each session.
Well, the hires that I've done, most of them were done online. They're paraprofessional positions, so they're not a national search. So, you know, the one thing that I found that I needed to do was to really set aside a lot of time for questions, because your candidates are going to have questions. Every single one of my candidates asked me about safety protocols, asked me about orientation and what training might look like. So, you know, just be prepared to spend a lot of time answering questions that they may have.
In terms of remote interviewing and scheduling, I found that when you do in-person interviews, you typically run back to back. So they sit down with the provost for an hour, and then somebody retrieves them and takes them somewhere else to HR or something. And it's this continuous back-to-back, which makes it very challenging for us to schedule. And it makes it very challenging for them because sometimes it seems like they don't have any breathing room. In the online environment, it's possible to stretch things out a bit. So even if it goes over 2, maybe 3 days, makes it much, much easier than compressing everything in that very short amount of time. Just make sure you give them a little bit of time, like Joelle said, and don't schedule them back to back. It can be difficult. But I would also recommend finding a couple of extra folks, something you wouldn't do in an in-person interview. People who can talk about your institution and your city or town. People who are big proponents of it, because you're asking someone to potentially uproot where they're living to come to a place where they have never seen or set foot in. And that can be very challenging. So finding people who can really represent your institution and build it up and talk about it well, who know the city and town well, can be of huge importance to interviewees. And especially for us, because when you're in a non-metropolitan campus, whether it's purely rural or like here at Lycoming, we're in Williamsport, we're used to selling our campus, where we are and the location. This is why you want to leave Baltimore and come to Williamsport. This is why you want to leave Minneapolis and come to Williamsport. It's really difficult to do that in a remote interview and let them know what you have available. So finding a couple of extra folks, even just 15 minutes at a time, who can come in and orient the interviewees would be incredibly helpful as well.
Okay, thank you so much. As a sort of bridge, I'd ask, as a bridge to the next question, I'll give my own advice too. And that's to have that personal touch. So maybe make a video of your library if the candidate can't travel. Make a video of your archives. If you have a campus tour, provide that information so this person can do this virtually. If you've got some resources you can easily send them, that's great. Giving it that personal touch is going to make them feel like they matter at a time when I think we all feel compressed. We all feel there's not enough time. And sometimes that personal touch makes all the difference from the candidate's perspective. And the other piece of my advice is to make sure that there's somebody there to handhold throughout the day, because popping into meeting after meeting after meeting is extremely stressful for the candidates. And it's often as if they're seeing disembodied heads they're probably never going to see again if you're interviewing 4 candidates. So that disembodied feeling of seeing this person and maybe I'll see them again or maybe I won't in a later meeting gives the whole interview an embodied, disembodied feeling. So having a personal person to touch in with, check in with once every morning or twice a morning, twice an afternoon, really helps that person get a feel for the institution. It gives that personal touch. So let's go ahead and move forward. And the next question is that hiring is already a stressful process, but now it's conducted entirely virtually. It's even more stressful. And this also applies to onboarding a new staff or faculty member. How would you help new hires join the culture from a distance or virtually?
Have a happy hour.
Yeah.
Seriously, why not? We do it with our friends and we enjoy it with our friends and we see the conversation, and having a happy hour after work that brings in some of your colleagues along with the new person allows the time for that informal chit chat just to get to know each other. Someone brings up a movie or a book or something and the conversation just rolls. It makes them feel as if they're part of the group and part of the organization, which can really help in terms of retention.
Yeah, for us, one of the things that we've been doing, and I've been really very deliberate, is to provide mentorship for especially my 2 newest hires who are new to Dickinson. My one hire was an internal candidate. But the 2, you know, it's not just to give them one mentor, it's to share that mentorship throughout my entire team of staff. So everybody gets to spend some time with them on one thing for the next several weeks, you know. So try to make it playful and give everybody a role to play.
I think the only thing I'd add here is if your institution uses a personality or workflow assessment like the DISC assessment or Myers-Briggs or whatever, encourage that new hire to take the assessment and then schedule a session to discuss their results with others in the organization who have taken the same assessment. So this kind of brings the new hire into the fold, but it also reinforces whatever outcomes you had hoped to achieve with the longstanding employees and allows them to kind of re-engage with that initiative.
Thanks.
Another thing I would add quickly is in most positions, we who are already at the institution can predict who those frequent campus partners are of the library and of that position, and make sure at some point early on that they get introduced to these people, whether it's via Zoom or Teams or whatever, that they have a chance to see and hear and identify with that person so that they have a name for the face as their training goes on.
I would go ahead and I would also say that now is a time to not just allow human resources to those processes to run and trust them as you can when you onboard somebody in person. You can allow that process to work. I think you have to be very proactive about making sure that process is working and staying in touch with the candidate. Keep in mind that oftentimes when people are onboarded in person, there's a whole host of people they can go ask, whether that's the person in the office next to them or somebody who's working, elsewhere in the library, and they've really hit it off with that person. A lot of those communication channels are shut off to them because they haven't been able to make those contacts in person. So I think you have to be very deliberate to make sure that those things are happening as we're coming back into the building as well. Some are working virtually. I think that actually makes it even more difficult to trust the processes that we have. I think we have to sort of overcome some of the limitations of those processes that are built to work in a virtual environment by being especially proactive and engaging and just mindful that people are joining a new organization and the culture is not going to come across virtually unless we're explicit about what that culture is. And that's a much different kind of conversation. So as we're kind of coming into the last part of the panel, I have one or two more questions. And I'd like to ask one about turmoil and obstacles that we've encountered in our searches, especially due to the lockdowns and travel restrictions above all. So can you talk about some of the craziness that you've seen? What kind of other crazy things have you encountered that you find worth sharing, whether it's an anecdote or a story or a change in policy that's really puts the point on, puts the emphasis to how much the world has turned upside down?
When I read this question, my first thought was, what hasn't been crazy about the last 3 months or so? But the things that I thought of here, at least here at CMU, which were surprising and added to the overall stress and turmoil of a hiring process. One was technology lag time. So we order our technology and equipment for new hires through our central computing services. And instead of, 2-3 day wait time, we had upwards of 3 weeks wait time. So we had persons onboarding that didn't have the kind of equipment and computers that they needed to do their work. So they were stuck using their personal machines, which was very uncomfortable, I think, for both parties. So the technology lag time has been a challenge. And I think, again, at CMU, we've had a lot of shifting in our HR processes and procedures, not only during the pandemic, but over the last couple of years. And so I think all of the ironing out of issues that has been going on in our HR realm they've just become exacerbated under the pandemic and have become really problematic in some ways. They've caused delays, confusion, all of which I think reflects poorly on CMU and on the libraries also, even though they're not necessarily our processes and procedures. And then finally, as a new hire myself, starting in February, and I think for those who are coming into the Pittsburgh area from outside, learning a new city in a pandemic is tough. I think Paige alluded to this earlier. In my case, especially if you have children who are navigating a new school system in the midst of all of this. So I ask, if not plea with the employers on this call who might be hiring soon to consider creating some kind of resources for employees who are new to your area, especially those with children, and perhaps ask one of your longstanding local employees to kind of pair with them as a virtual guide to the city, or just someone new that they can go to with questions.
Really good advice, Joelle. I would also recommend you make sure you stay in close touch with the provost, with your provost or dean and HR, just to make sure that everything remains in line in terms of plans and schedule, and ask them to please be very honest with you when they might be considering pulling the plug on a search, because it can be a huge time investment on your part and on the part of your staff. And having the rug pulled out from underneath you can be painful. Keep an eye on the Pennsylvania Department of Health page about travel, because there's a page that's updated every Friday that has a list of, I think there are 19 states on it currently, that Pennsylvania recommends a 14-day quarantine. And here at Lycoming College, we had students had to observe that. If they came from one of those states, they had to come 14 days early in quarantine before they could be on campus. And so we are doing the same thing for faculty and staff, new hires. And interviewing someone from one of those states is not even possible, because who has the money to put someone up for 2 weeks? So that can have a dramatic impact on your search as well. Just being very, very aware.
I have nothing to add. I think Joelle and Paige have handled that question really well.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks for that, Maureen. Maybe you could lead us off with this next one, and this is our final question. What recommendations for resources in the professional development space do you have for our audience?
Well, I think I thought about this a lot. Our campus, we're very fortunate to have a robust HR program for professional development. Some of the sessions that are on there can be really useful, like the 7 Habits for Highly Effective People. There's emotional well-being classes, which I think all of us need, just to be able to handle stress. Just looking into those types of classes, if not at your own institution, but maybe in your community, where you can get some stress relief and be prepared for the next chapter.
I think my #1 recommendation would be training and readings for supervisors, especially new supervisors. I think it's hard enough to manage and lead people in a normal environment, and it's incredibly difficult to do so in such an economically, organizationally, personally challenging time for everyone. And I mean, we're working on something here at CMU, a management leadership reading resource for our supervisors, but I think this could be done, in this PALCI space with webinars, synchronous but confidential discussions, those types of things, I think could really empower our supervisors to wade through all of the sticky issues that come with personnel supervision. And I would love to see more of that and absorb more of that from my folks here too.
I must apologize. I misread this question slightly. I took it as more advice for interviewees.
Let's hear that too. I think that would be great to round out the perspective.
Okay. First of all, interviewing obviously is very stressful and tricky anyway, but when you're interviewing on Zoom and staring at a screen, it can really throw you off. And you don't want to be off your game when you're interviewing. So under normal circumstances, it can be recommended oftentimes that you do a mock interview just so you can practice handling some of these questions being hurled at you. And this is even more important in terms of a remote interview. Get online with someone you know and trust and have them ask you questions, and practice sitting there under a stressful condition, talking to a screen and maybe even not even seeing somebody. That's really difficult. And then a couple of other little tips, things like check your background, make sure everything you have behind you is in order, that something isn't weird or wonky or offensive. Ask others in your home, they can please lay off the Wi-Fi a little bit while you're interviewing so that your video doesn't get choppy and messy. You want to look your best. Make sure, and I think Joelle alluded to this earlier, make sure that you can operate the application, whether it's Zoom, Skype, Teams, whatever that they're using. Get on somehow, even if they don't invite you. Find somebody and get on that platform so that you know how it works. You know how to do the screen sharing if you're giving a presentation. And finally, don't dress halfway. Just because you're only going to be seen from here up, dress all the way as if you were in the room with the interviewer. I subscribe to the theory, look good, feel good, do good.
Great. And my advice would be to every few days try on your interview clothes just to make sure they still fit. Because during the COVID lockdowns, pajamas would have you believe that all is well in the sweatsuit kingdom. But if you're not trying your work clothes on, you may discover that the buttons on your shirts and the latches on your belt have started socially distancing from each other. Now, all humor aside, my advice is to keep the big picture in mind and remember that nothing is permanent. Whether you're a library or you're a job candidate, if you're in a good spot right now, that's great. But keep in mind that it may not last. A little attention to your CV and a glance at the ALA job list may be warranted. I think phone interviews are going the way of the dodo. And now we need to have a new set of skills for video interviewing for that first round. You might discover just how much things have changed since you were last interviewing. And if you're not in a good spot right now and maybe things feel a bit overwhelming, and maybe you're even on the job market, remember that no feeling is final, as the German poet and author Rilke writes. It's a tough spot to be in when things are tumultuous and you're looking for a job. Not only do you experience anxiety because things are overwhelming, you also feel the need not to feel those negative emotions so you can be at your best when interviewing. You're kind of stuck sometimes. So talking it out, whether with a friend, a family member, or a career coach, can help ease these transitions so that you can mindfully drop those emotions as they arise, and so you can be the most impactful you when you most need it. I wish everyone lots of luck in their job search, as well as in their job fulfillment, filling jobs, and hope that we can connect in person to continue these conversations before too long. Let's have a big virtual round of applause for our panelists. And we have a big thanks to them for sharing their wisdom and their experience. And I hope everyone in the audience has found this helpful. We have time for about 10 or 15 minutes for questions. I certainly hope that the audience has questions. We have eager panelists ready to answer your questions. So please enter them into the Q&A option that we have there. And I will forward these, I will present these to the panelists. We have one question here. It says, following up Paige's point about administrations looking to cut costs even after the pandemic, do you expect that institutions will try to replace permanent full-time librarians with contingent temporary library positions?
Anything's possible. Anything's possible when administrators on the high level looking at the institution from 10,000 feet are looking at budgets. They have to make difficult decisions, and oftentimes administrators don't fully comprehend the breadth and depth of what we do. And so for them, someone that high to make a decision is not inconceivable. Sad but true.
Yeah.
I feel like at CMU, we have a pretty supportive group of upper administrators who really want us to put forward the rationale for new hires, for reclassifying positions, all of that kind of personnel movement. So I don't feel like we would be in danger of them coming down and saying, well, because of the budget or because of the pandemic, you can't hire what you need in order to function effectively. But I would echo Paige, anything can happen. And I think we'll start to see maybe some more movement in this area once we start getting our fall enrollment numbers back at our respective institutions and really see what the economic hit is going to be.
Yeah, and I hate to admit, I think that's the bottom line. Things may be changing in regard to having permanent positions and versus temporary positions. It's going to be up to the administration, and I think that money is the deciding factor in all of it.
I think it's a great question. I would point out that I think it's pretty universal that our administrations used to be operating in a maybe 1 to 3 year, 1 to 5 year time frame. And I've never worked in an environment where that time frame is compressed down to can be measured in months, and probably almost towards the singular month, where we're wondering, we're making decisions on the fly that impact us next month, and these have significant changes. The terrain has changed so radically that I guess I'm trying to say that the question's asking a long-term question. It's a valid one, but in a short-term context. And to reverse the question about what are the short-term implications of this on hiring in the long term, I think is a really interesting way of looking at this. So let me just sort of rephrase the question differently from a different angle. What do you think is going to change about hiring going forward? What are we going to retain from COVID going forward with interviewing? What do our panelists need to be thinking about? What do our interviewers need to be thinking about? Do I really need to get comfortable with this piece of interviewing virtually because it's going to go away when we open up again? Maybe that's not the case. What are your thoughts on that from both perspectives, interviewer and job filler?
I'll start with just saying, one of my favorite words out of this whole COVID thing is pivot. You're going to have to be able to pivot. And I think that you have to make yourself marketable all the time. So, being able to take on new tasks and learn new job skills and, being able to help, like Joelle said earlier, with digitization projects and, other instructional design ideas. We have to be able to be a little more flexible and be able to build our skill sets and pivot quickly.
And Joelle mentioned earlier the importance of technology and the skills associated with operating technology in the job place. And I've heard people say things, even not in the last couple of months, but recently in libraries, that they are just not that tech savvy. And when you ask them about technology, they say, well, I can work with Word and PowerPoint. That is not enough. And that's going to become, for me and probably for many others, a red flag, right? We can't have people who are not very tech savvy, who are not comfortable with the technology, because this could happen again. This could get worse. Who knows? This could be much longer term than any of us ever dreamed. And we need people who can pivot and can be tech savvy and be able to adapt to other new technologies.
Okay, I'm going to move us along to our next question. We probably have time for one more question if someone in the audience would like to pose one. With such large applicant pools, are you doing anything differently in terms of reviewing CVs or looking for specific skills beyond those already mentioned?
I think it was Paige that mentioned this earlier, that it's a buyer's market right now. Our pools have been huge, and we have a ton of really qualified folks applying for our jobs. So it's really tough, I think, for especially entry-level folks to really get their foot in the door when we have, you know, folks who are in many cases overqualified for the jobs that we're posting and hiring for. But I would say the things that stand out to me aren't in the resume. It's in the cover letters that really highlight somebody's, again, organizational citizenship focus, somebody who's willing to jump in and try new things. I would really emphasize, you know, carefully crafting that cover letter, not only to address, you know, every point in the job ad, which you should do anyway, but really making clear your intent and excitement about joining an organization in whatever capacity that organization needs it to look like, knowing that it might change.
I second Joelle. The cover letter is critical, and when you have that many applications for one position, it's terribly easy for us to go through the cover letters and go, yeah, no, and just pass them up. And so you need to be tip-top in your cover letter, because if you have poor grammar, if you don't represent yourself well, if you're scattered, it's going to show very soon, very quickly, and we're going to dismiss you because we have so many others who are qualified.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. I have nothing to add.
I would add to that candidates can do what they've always done to stand out. And it is a numbers game, but it's also a question of negotiating as a candidate. What are they looking for with what I'm selling? And so reading the job description, not only answering that you can do everything, but understanding how those things fit together, and most importantly, what they're looking for. So for instance, in a job, the screening round, this comes up, this is a softball question that many people miss. You can get this right off the bat in a cover letter. Why are you interested in the position? You want to be answering that question in a way that corresponds with the one or two top points in that job description. That's how do you connect to this position? Why is it meaningful to you? And you also want to show some of your human side, right? Well, the position's in Baltimore, and I love the Inner Harbor, for instance, or something along those lines. You need to be kind of part strategist about tying in who you are, who you really feel you are, going back to Paige's excellent point about be who you are, but you're also selling your skill set to what they're looking for, and at the same time being human, bringing forth that there's a human on the other line here, and you're not just trying to game the system in a way that works for you. And recognize that if you find that cynical, it's kind of coming from a manager perspective where there's a system in place and you just heard how that system works. If you've got your CV in order and a good cover letter, your shoulders above everybody else in terms of that search, because the employers are using those as criteria to make their pool smaller, to make their decision easier. And that's just the way it is. So it makes a lot of sense for you to sort of comply with the way the system works. And at the same time, be a human, be another human on the line, because that's who they want to hire. They want to hire that human being. But they first have to check off the boxes that you are such and such. I don't have any more questions. I think we're running out of time. I'd want to turn it back to our panelists just to see if you have any concluding thoughts about this or any parting thoughts for our audience today.
If you are interviewing and you have a short phone interview with the director or with somebody, or you have that first initial Skype or Zoom interview, don't ask for a favor. That actually happened. I had someone ask, is there someone there? Do one of your librarians? I'd really like to figure out how to get into publishing and writing. And is there someone there who can help me? I was like, ooh, not a good idea. So don't ask for favors.
I would just say that, you know, take the pressure off yourself. It's a difficult time for everyone. You know, we're going to get through this. It's just going to take some time, and you know what you need. You know what you need in your library and what's going to work for your library. So, you know, just give yourself a break.
I think I would just conclude with think of this as an opportunity as much as you can to not only diversify your workforce, but to perhaps add in some tasks, some roles, some foci that involve things that you haven't done before, that you've always wanted to do, or that you think you could pivot and do in this new environment. Because now is a time when I think we can experiment and take risks without a lot of ramifications if things don't work out. We can always reclassify, we can always you know, rewrite a PD, but now is the time to maybe jump in and look for something or somebody that might throw your organization into a more forward-looking one.
All right. Well, thanks so much to our panelists. Jill, I'm going to turn it back to you just to see if you wanted to close us out.
Great. Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists. I'm so glad that all of you were able to be here, and that we'll have the recording for this session afterward. If you do have questions for our panelists, I would encourage you to send them to me, jill@palci.org, and I'd be happy to forward anything on to any of our panelists who I'm sure would be more than happy to speak with you. And I just want to give a quick reminder that we do have one more PALCI member meeting event that is happening next Wednesday, the 16th at 12 p.m. We're going to be celebrating some folks who were nominated for PALCI awards. This is our new community award that we're offering to folks who were nominated, and nominations were across the board for lots of different types of contributions that folks made, whether in their own institutions or to communities or groups. And so we're going to be celebrating those folks next week, and I would just encourage you to attend and clap along with us. It's our PALCI iClap Award, which is PALCI spelled backwards, and we are looking forward to that bit of fun in our day next week. So thank you once again to all of our panelists. We'll be sure to get this recording out to everyone, and we'll hopefully see you next week. Take care, everybody. Thanks.
Bye.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.